For 30 years, the town below the pass had called him the Savage, and not one of them had ever once asked him why he did not speak. That was the whole of it, right there, if you knew how to read it. A man who will not talk is the easiest man in the world to decide things about, and the people of Cedar Gap had decided everything about Thomas Wren a long time ago. In his absence, the way you settle the worth of a stone you have already kicked out of the road. They climbed past him that morning, 11 men of the Territorial Railroad Survey hauling a brass transit and a steel chain up into a high white bowl of snow, and the mute guide stood at the foot of the slope, with both bare hands thrown out flat and hard in front of him, his weather-cracked face wide open with a warning he had no voice to give. He had been pointing at that slope and refusing to set a boot on it for 2 days. They laughed and shoved past his outstretched arms, and the last man up turned and waved at him, the way you wave off a dog. And then Thomas Wren heard the one sound he had spent his entire life listening for. Somewhere up under that smooth, sun-bright, beautiful field of snow, the mountain made a deep, hollow, settling whoomp, like a great door closing in a buried house, and the whole world above him began, very gently to move. Rewind. Go back 9 days, down off the high white spine of the divide, to the rotten little railhead town of Cedar Gap, which sat in a notch of the mountains, the way a bad tooth sits in a jaw, crooked, aching, and certain it was the center of everything. One muddy street churned to soup by spring melt, a general store, a false-fronted saloon, a surveyor's office, raw new telegraph poles still weeping sap. Cedar Gap believed with its whole greedy little heart that the railroad was coming, and that whichever way the rails crossed the divide would make some men rich and leave the rest behind. And so it had talked of nothing else all winter. And the one man in that country who knew the high passes better than any living soul, who could have told them which notch the snow would let a railroad through and which it would bury every spring, was the one man none of them would lower themselves to ask, because he could not answer back in words, and a town like Cedar Gap trusts nothing it cannot argue with. Thomas Wren was 35 years old and built like the country he lived in, long and heavy through the shoulders, with deeply weather-browned skin and pale storm-gray eyes that took the whole measure of a slope or a sky or a man's face in one quiet sweep and gave nothing back. His dark hair was tied back off a wind-creased face, and he wore a long fur-collared coat of buckskin and wool, and around his neck on a rawhide cord he carried 2 things. One was a small, fat, snow-swollen field book bound in cracked leather, its pages gone soft with damp, a stub of graphite pencil lashed alongside it, and that book was the nearest thing to a voice Thomas Wren had in the world. What his hands could not show you, he wrote, and held up, and let you read. The other was a tiny bird whistle carved from a knot of mountain juniper, worn dark as a chestnut, the only sound he ever made on purpose, a single, clear 2-note call that carried half a mile across the snow, and the men of Cedar Gap who had heard it drift down off the peaks and not known what it was, had decided naturally that it was something wild. He had not always been silent. That was the part the town never knew and never thought to wonder about. Thomas Wren had been born higher up that same range in a miner's cabin, and he had talked and laughed like anyone, until the winter he was 8 years old, when a slope very much like the one above Cedar Gap had let go in the blue dark of a January night and come down on the cabin where his whole family slept, and buried them all under 14 feet of snow and broken timber, and left only him, thrown clear by the blast of wind that runs ahead of the snow, alive on the surface in the screaming cold. He had dug with his bare hands for a day and a night, alone, and had not reached one of them in time. And when a passing trapper finally found him, half frozen and still digging, he had not spoken. Not that day, and not ever again. Whatever the snow took from him when it took his family, it took his voice down with it. The town that would one day call him the savage did not know a word of this. They had simply found it easier, all of them, to decide that a silent man was an empty one. And if you have ever been the quiet one in a loud room, the one the important people talked over and around and about, the one whose silence everyone felt free to fill in with whatever ugly thing was convenient for them, then you already know exactly what kind of man this story is about, and you already belong on this channel. That is the only kind of story I tell up here, the ones the whole town wrote off, the ones nobody would go back for, the quiet ones who turn out to be the only ones who were ever really listening. Take a second and subscribe, because the people who do are the ones I am telling these stories to. Into this came the railroad survey, and the man who owned it, and the woman who would change everything. The survey was a real one, sent from the territorial capital to chart a rail route over the divide. 11 men under a hired chief of party with their transit and their chains. Good, practical men, most of them. Not cruel, only certain. Certain the way educated men from the flatland are always certain about a mountain they have looked at for 2 weeks. But the survey did not pay for itself. Financing it, riding up to Cedar Gap in a fine fur coat to see his investment through, was a land and railroad speculator named Augustus Pell. And Augustus Pell did not care which way the railroad ought to cross the divide, only which way would make him rich. He had spent 2 years quietly buying up worthless land along the high northern notch. Wolf Ear Pass, the locals called it, a broad saddle that looked from the valley like the only sensible way through. And if the rails went over Wolf Ear, the land he had bought for nothing became a fortune, and if they went anywhere else, he was ruined. There was just one trouble with Wolf Ear. It was a killing ground. The whole north face above the saddle was a loaded gun of wind-slapped snow that avalanched every winter and most springs, and there was exactly one man in the territory who could and would say so out loud, except that he could not say anything out loud at all. Because, of course, Augustus Pell, when he came up to Cedar Gap, did the careful thing, the prudent thing. He hired the best mountain guide in the country to take his survey over the divide and confirm the route. He hired Thomas Wren. He knew only what the saloon told him, that the mute fellow up at the Timberline knew every notch of that range by heart. And Pell was a businessman, and a businessman hires the best. And for the first 3 days it went well enough. Wren led them up into the high country with a sureness that quieted even the chief of party, reading the snow and the wind and the set of the cornices, choosing his ground, writing his short, flat notes and holding them up. This slope will not hold after noon, and south side of the ridge, not north, and most of the survey men watching him work began without quite admitting it to feel they were in the hands of someone who knew a thing they did not. But Augustus Pell rode behind them with a knot of dread tightening in his chest, because every flat little note the mute man held up was leading the survey away from Wolf Ear Pass, toward the lower southern notch, the safe one, the one that would leave Pell penniless. And Pell understood, somewhere around the 3rd afternoon, that he had made a terrible mistake. He had hired an honest man. The woman was named Della Hartley, 24 years old, and she had come up the mountain with the survey for the simplest and hardest reason there is, to finish something a dead man had started. Her father had been Josiah Hartley, the old territorial surveyor, the first man ever to chart these passes properly, dead the winter before of a failing heart in a chair by his own fire, his last maps half drawn on the table in front of him. And it was Josiah Hartley, 15 years gone now, who had been the one man in that country ever to treat the silent young man at the Timberline as something other than a savage. He had hired Thomas Wren as a chainman on his early surveys, had learned to read his notes and his hands, had said to anyone who would listen that the mute fellow had the finest mountain sense he had met in 40 years of the trade. And then Josiah had grown old, and the work had dried up, and they had drifted apart, and the silent man had gone up alone into the high country to live, and the town had filled the silence back in with the old ugly word. Della had been very young in those years. She remembered dimly a huge, gentle, quiet man who had once carried her across a flooded creek on his shoulders and made her a whistle out of a piece of juniper. She did not. Riding up to Cedar Gap to see her father's last work done right, connect that memory to the grim weathered giant the survey men called the savage behind his back. Not at first. She connected it on the second night in the high camp when she watched him. The survey men talked over him and around him all evening, loud with coffee and importance, planning the next day's climb up toward Wolf Ear, because Augustus Pell had begun quietly to push for it. And through all of it, the mute guide sat a little apart at the edge of the firelight, and Della, who had grown up reading A Careful Man, watched his gray eyes move. She saw that he missed nothing. She saw that when one of the chainmen said something foolish about the snow, the smallest flicker crossed the guide's face, gone in an instant. She saw him take out the field book and write something slowly and look at it, and not hold it up, because no one was looking at him to read it, and put it away. And something turned over in Della Hartley's chest, an old memory rising through 15 years of cold water, and she got up and crossed the firelight and sat down in the snow beside the man the whole camp had written off, and said the first kind words anyone in Cedar Gap had said to him in longer than he could remember. "My father always said you could read this country better than any man alive." And Thomas Wren went very still. And then, slowly, he opened the field book to a fresh page and wrote and turned it toward her in the firelight, and what it said was, "Your father was the only one who ever learned to listen." And that was the beginning of it. The next 2 days, the thing between the mute guide and the dead surveyor's daughter built itself the only way a thing like that can, slowly, sideways, almost entirely without words. She took to walking beside him on the trail. She found, to her own surprise, that she could read him, that 15 years in a child's memory had taught her how to listen to a man with her eyes. She learned that a tilt of his head toward a far cornice meant danger, and a flat downward press of his palm meant slow, wait, hold, and that a note held up was worth 10 of the chief of party speeches. She started, without anyone asking, to translate him to the others. "He says the slab up there is wind-loaded. He says keep to the timber." And the survey men who would not take it from a mute took it from a young woman in a blue wool dress, and did not notice that every safe decision they made was his. And Thomas Wren, who had lived alone above the tree line for 15 years, because the valley had taught him he was a thing to be feared or pitied, and never simply known, found himself walking the mountain beside a person who looked at his hands when he spoke with them. He did not know what to do with it. He wrote her things in the field book he had never written for anyone, the names he had given the peaks, the place a man could find water in a dry year, the way the light came up gold on the granite the morning after a hard freeze. She read every one. She kept some. On the 4th day, the whole thing came to its head, because Augustus Pell could wait no longer. They had reached the high junction where the country forced a choice, south to the low safe notch, the way the mute guide had been steadily leading them, or north and up toward the broad, beautiful saddle of Wolf Ear Pass, the way that would make Pell a fortune and kill anyone who tried to cross it in the wrong week. And the wrong week was that week. There had been 3 days of wind out of the southwest, loading the leeward north face of Wolf Ear with a deep, dense, unstable slab of drifted snow. And then a hard freeze. And then this morning a sun that was working on the surface like a slow hand on a trigger. Thomas Wren knew all of it. He knew it the way you know your own heartbeat. He had read it in the plume of snow blowing off the summits and the hollow drum sound the snowpack had made under his boots at dawn, and the hoarfrost growing like fur in the shaded hollows. And he stood at that junction and he did everything a man without a voice can do to stop them. He stepped in front of the chief of party. He held up the field book, and the page said, in the hard block letters he made when it mattered most, "Wolf-Ear will slide today. Do not go up." And when they hesitated, he wrote another and held it higher. "I will take you over south in 2 days. Nobody dies." And for one long moment, on the strength of Della Hartley's voice, reading those words aloud, and the plain terror in the mute man's face, the survey wavered and very nearly turned south, and the whole history of that valley nearly went another way. And then Augustus Pell laughed. It was the most important laugh of his life, and he had no idea. He stepped his horse forward into the middle of them, and he made a show of it, warm and reasonable and contemptuous all at once, and he said the thing that decided everything. "Gentlemen," he said, "are we surveyors of the territory, men of science, of instruments, are we going to let a dumb savage who can't string 2 words together and lives in a hole in the snow tell us our business?" He let it land. He spread his hands. The man can't even tell you why. He just waves his arms and points. There's snow on every slope in this country. That's what a mountain is. The northern saddle is the obvious route. It's the route the capital wants, and we are losing daylight. And it worked, because it was designed to work. It gave 11 cold, tired, ambitious men permission to do the thing that was easy and profitable, instead of the thing that was hard and safe, and a way to feel like the clever ones for doing it. The chief of party looked at the broad, sunny saddle of Wolf-Ear, so calm, so beautiful, so obviously passable, and at the mute man waving his book, and he made his choice. "We'll take the north route," he said. "Wren, you're paid through today. You can come or not." And they shouldered their packs and started up the long, open snowfield toward Wolf-Ear. And Augustus Pell rode in the middle of them with the dread finally gone out of his chest, because the honest man had been beaten in public, and that was the only thing Pell had ever really needed. If you've made it this far into Tom's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Thomas Wren did not leave. Della would remember that for the rest of her life, that when they cast him off and called him a savage and climbed up onto the loaded gun of that slope, the mute guide did not turn around and let the fools die, which would have been his right, and which the town would have done to him without a flicker. Instead, he ran. He went up after them at an angle, off to the side of their track, onto a spine of wind-scoured rock that he knew the snow could not take, and he climbed faster than men half his weight, and got above them and did the last thing he had left to do. He put the little juniper whistle to his lips and blew it, that clear 2-note call, again and again, as hard as he could send it across the snow, not because he thought they would understand it, but because a sharp sound is sometimes the very thing that triggers a slope, already a half-second from going. And Thomas Wren had made the cold decision, in the space of a breath, that if that slab was coming down on 11 men either way, then by God, it would come down now, while they were still low and bunched and findable, and not in 20 minutes when they were strung out high across the middle of the killing ground. He blew the whistle to bring the mountain down on his own terms, and the mountain answered him. There was the whoomp again, the deep, hollow, settling boom that Della felt in her own chest from 400 yards below, the sound of an enormous mass of snow losing its grip on the mountain all at once. A crack ran across the white face of Wolf-Ear, like a black thread drawn by an invisible hand, a quarter-mile of it, faster than thought. And then the whole slope above the survey party stood up and turned into a river. It did not slide so much as explode, a churning, roaring wall of snow and ice and wind that came down the face of Wolf Ear at the speed of a galloping horse, throwing a cloud of glittering crystal 100 feet into the blue sky ahead of it, a sound like the end of the world rolling down the valley. The survey man had time to turn. That was all. They turned and saw it, and then it was on them. And the brass transit and the steel chain and 11 shouting men were swallowed whole and ground under and buried in less time than it has taken you to read this, under a deposit 10 and 15 and 20 feet deep that set up hard as poured concrete the instant it stopped moving. And then there was silence, the most complete and terrible silence in the world, the silence after a slide, the crystal clouds still hanging and glittering in the brilliant sun, the great raw scar of the slope standing naked and gray above a vast tumbled field of broken white, where a moment before there had been a survey. Della Hartley stood at the bottom of it and screamed her father's name, which made no sense, except that grief makes no sense, and the only living thing that moved on that whole white mountain was a huge dark figure already plunging down off the rock spine into the deposit, the man they had called a savage, running toward the buried men with the whistle still between his teeth and the field book bouncing at his chest, the one man in the territory who knew what now had to be done, and the only one who had ever meant to. What followed was the longest afternoon of Della Hartley's life, and it taught the whole valley in the end the thing it had refused for 30 years to learn. Because here is the truth about an avalanche that the dime novels never tell you. The snow does not usually kill a buried man outright. The slide knocks the wind from him and packs him into the dark, and then he has minutes. 15, perhaps, if he is lucky and near the surface, and there is an air pocket at his face. Far less if he is deep, before the snow that froze solid around his own breath seals him in and he runs out of air. Which means that every life under that broken field came down now to speed, and to one thing more precious than gold on a mountain, the knowledge of where to dig. And Thomas Wren had that knowledge in his hands and his eyes, as no other man alive in that country had it. He had watched the slope go. He had marked in the cold lightning flash of his mind the exact place each man was standing when the white wall took him. And he had read where the snow piles and where it scours. And he came off that rock into the deposit already knowing, to within a few yards, where 11 men lay buried in the dark. He did not waste a second on grief or on triumph or on the bitter earned pleasure of having been right. He simply began, with a terrible driving economy, to save the lives of the men who had spat on him an hour before. He found the first man in 90 seconds. He went straight to a low fold in the churned snow that meant nothing to Della's eye, and he dropped to his knees and tore at it with his bare hands, and the short wooden shovel slung on his back, throwing snow like a digging animal. And 4 feet down, his hands closed on a wool collar, and he hauled the chief of party, the very man who had cast him off, up out of the snow, blue-faced and choking but alive, and shoved him at Della to clear his mouth and breathe him back, and was already moving, already reading the next fold, before the man had drawn a full breath. He found the second man, and the third, the same way, fast, sure, brutal, wasting nothing. And it was here, in the middle of the worst hour of her life, with her mittens packed with snow and a half-dead stranger coughing in her lap, that Della Hartley understood all at once and forever what her father had meant, and what the town had never once troubled itself to see, that the silence of Thomas Wren had never been emptiness, had never been savagery, had never been a thing missing. It had been attention. The whole of him, every hour of his life, had been turned outward and listening to a mountain that the loud men of the valley could not be bothered to hear over the sound of their own voices. And that listening, that lifelong unbroken quiet, was the only reason any of them were going to live to see the sun go down. The thing they had called his defect was the only thing on that mountain that could save them. The work went on into the failing afternoon, and it was not all victory. It could not be. He dug out 7 men alive in the first hour, one after another. An impossible thing no one in that territory would afterward quite believe until they saw the living men with their own eyes. But the slide had taken 11, and as the light went gold and the terrible cold of a high country evening came creeping up out of the snow, there were 4 men still under it, dug for and not yet found, and Thomas Wren drove himself past the point where his body should have quit. And Della worked beside him until her hands would not close. The 2 of them and the 7 gasping men they had pulled back from the dark, all laboring now in the blue dusk for the 4 who were left. They found the 8th alive at the very edge of dark, deep, in an air pocket no bigger than a wash basin, by the guide's unerring sense of where the snow would have carried him. The last 3 they did not find in time. Augustus Pell's rout over Wolf Ear had cost 3 men their lives, 3 good practical chainmen with families down in the flatland, and it would have cost 8 more, every soul on that survey, if the mute savage they had laughed off the mountain had gone home as any sane man would have, instead of staying to bring the slope down on his own terms and dig their lives back out of it with his hands. That was the arithmetic of that afternoon. 7 saved outright, 1 more at the edge of dark, 3 lost, and 1 man left standing in the ruined snow at nightfall, who had done the whole of it without a single word, and would not, even here, be thanked, because thanking him would have meant admitting what they had done. And 1 man who had not lifted a hand. Augustus Pell had been at the rear when the slope let go, mounted on the scoured edge, and the slide had missed him clean. Had buried the men of science he had goaded up the mountain and left their financier sitting his horse at the margin, without a flake on his fine fur coat. And in the long horror of that afternoon, while a mute man dug 11 graves open one by one, hoping to find them empty, Augustus Pell had begun, with the cold, quick mind that had made him his money, to do arithmetic of his own. He had watched the 7 men come up alive, and he had understood, sitting there on his untouched horse, that every one of them was now a witness, that the route had been his idea, forced through over the frantic written warning of the one true expert on that mountain, that the warning had been dead right, and that 3 men were dead because Augustus Pell had called the man who was right a savage and climbed anyway. 7 living witnesses, a dead man's daughter, and a mute guide with a field book full of dated warnings in his own hand. That field book, Pell realized, was a noose, a sworn legal record kept by the only credible witness on the mountain, and it would hang him, would brand him a man whose greed had murdered 3 surveyors, and make his name a curse from the capital to the coast. Augustus Pell rode down off that mountain in the dark, a badly frightened man. And somewhere on the way down, the fright curdled, the way it does in a certain kind of man, into a plan. But all of that was still to come, and the immediate trouble was the cold and the dark, and the fact that 10 exhausted, half-frozen people, Della, the 8 rescued survivors, and the guide, were stranded above the tree line at nightfall, with 3 days' hard travel between them and the valley, and a temperature falling like a stone. They could not go down in the dark over avalanche debris with frostbitten men. It would have killed the weakest of them inside the hour. And here, again, in the plain work of keeping people alive through a high, cold night, Thomas Wren was the only one who knew what to do. and he did it without being asked, the way he did everything. He got them off the open deposit and into the lee of a granite wall out of the wind. He showed Della and the strongest of the men how to dig, not a fire. There was nothing up there to burn, but a snow shelter, a long, low cave hollowed back into a deep, hard drift. The snow that kills you turned in the right hands into the very thing that saves you. He packed the injured into the middle where the warmth of bodies would hold, and sealed the entrance to a single low crawl hole. And inside that buried hollow, the cold climbed from killing to merely brutal and held there. And 10 people who would have died in the open lived through the night. And in the deep, cold middle of that night, when one of the frostbitten chainmen began to shake and moan, Della heard the mute guide move in the dark and press something into the suffering man's hands and strike a match to show him what it was. And it was the field book, open to a page, and on the page in the steady block, letters was written, "Hold on. The sun comes up at the notch. I have seen it 1,000 times. It is worth staying for." The man held the book against his chest and stopped shaking and held on. That was how Thomas Wren comforted a dying man. He wrote him a reason to live, and he was right about it. And the sun came up. It came up the way he had promised, gold and enormous and silent, breaking over the far notch and pouring down the length of the ruined valley, and turning the Avalanche field from gray horror to blinding white jewel. And it found 10 living people crawling out of a hole in the snow into the brutal, clean morning, alive against all sense, because one of them had known how. They couldn't yet go down. 2 of the rescued men could not walk, and the guide judged the debris too dangerous and the men too weak until they had rested, and the day had warmed the worst of the ice. So they spent that day and the next sheltered above the tree line, 8 broken survivors coming slowly back to themselves under the care of the dead surveyor's daughter and the man they had wronged. And in those strange suspended days, 2 things happened that the rest of this story turns upon. The first was that the 7 men who had laughed at Thomas Wren stopped laughing forever and began, in the awkward, broken way of proud men who have been profoundly wrong, to look at him with a thing none of them had ever shown him, respect, as they watched him melt snow and splint a broken wrist and read the weather and keep them all alive, asking nothing, and the word savage died quietly in each of them, one man at a time, replaced by something much closer to awe. And the second was that Della Hartley and the mute guide, shut up in the high cold with nothing to do but keep 10 people breathing, fell the rest of the way into something neither of them had a word for, and did not need one, because words had never been the language they were speaking in. It deepened in silence and in work, as everything real about Thomas Wren always had. On the second day, Della's own hands cracked and split and bled from the snow and the cold. Her town hands, her surveyor's daughter hands that had never done a brutal thing in their life. And she was trying not to let anyone see. And the mute guide crossed the shelter and took her ruined hands in his enormous warm ones and turned them over and looked at them. And then opened the field book one-handed and wrote and showed her. And it said, "Your father's hands looked like this the first winter. He was proud of it. So am I." And Della Hartley, who had not truly wept for her father in the whole year since he died, put her face down into those 2 huge hands that smelled of cold stone and pine, and wept at last for the old man and for the strange, unbearable kindness of the silent one, and for the thing happening to her on this terrible mountain that she could not stop and no longer wanted to. He did not say anything, because he could not, and because nothing needed saying. He held her hands until she was done. That was the whole of it. It was more than any words she had ever been given. And it was in those same shut-in days that he gave her the thing that broke the story open, though he did not know that was what he was doing. On the last night above the tree line, with the rescued men sleeping and the cold pressing in, Della finally asked him the question she had been carrying since the firelit camp days before. She asked him, gently with her eyes as much as her voice, how he had known her father. And Thomas Wren sat a long while in the dark, and then he took out the field book and turned not to a fresh page, but to the very back of it, where the leather cover had been split and resewn into a kind of pocket, and from that pocket he drew a single folded square of paper, soft as cloth with age, and held it a moment as though it weighed a great deal, and gave it to Della. It was a letter, in her father's hand. Josiah Hartley had written it to Thomas Wren 15 years before, at the end of their last survey together, when the old man's eyes were failing and the work was drying up, and he knew he was sending the silent young man back up the mountain to a country that would not understand him. And Thomas Wren had carried it against his heart through 15 years of high solitude, the one thing anyone had ever written for him instead of about him. She unfolded it by matchlight with her hands shaking, and read her dead father's voice speaking across 15 years and one hard year of grief. And what it said was this: Thomas, they will never hear you down there, and I am too old now to keep being your voice, and that is the great sorrow of my life, because I have worked these mountains 40 years, and I tell you plainly I have never known a finer mind on a slope than the one behind your quiet. The trouble was never with you. The trouble was always with their ears. So go on up where the country makes sense and read it, and keep your book. And one day, not soon, but one day, somebody is going to come up that mountain who knows how to listen, the way I learned to. And when they do, you give them everything. Do not make them dig for it the way the rest of us made you dig. You have spent your whole life being told that what is wrong with you is the silence. Hear it from one old man who knows better before he goes. The silence was never the wound, Thomas. The silence was the gift. They were simply too loud, every one of them, ever to receive it. Keep watch up there. And when the one who can hear you finally comes, and she will come, do not let her leave thinking she owes you for it. Whatever you give her, give it free. That is the only way any of it was ever worth a thing. And under that, the old man had signed his name, and the date, and below the date, as though he had known, as though some surveyor's instinct in him had charted a line clean across 15 years to this exact snow cave, and this exact woman. He had added one last line. Her name is Della. She is my daughter. She is the best thing I ever made. Take care of each other. And Della Hartley sat in the dark with her father's letter in her two cracked hands and the silent man across from her who had carried it next to his heart for 15 years, waiting for her to climb up out of her own life and read it, and the whole world turned over. Because do you see what it did? That letter. It dissolved the debt. All those days Della had been carrying a thing she had not said aloud, that she owed this man everything, that he had saved her life and 8 others and asked nothing, that the weight of it sat on her like a stone. And the letter reached 15 years forward to spring her from exactly that trap. It told her there was no debt, that the silent man had been instructed by the one person they had both loved to give her everything free, and that he had been waiting her whole life to do it. The thing between them was not a thing she owed him. It was a thing her father had left to both of them, the way a man leaves the best of what he has to the 2 people he most wants to have it. And the only way to honor it was to take it freely and give freely back, and keep no ledger at all. And the question that had sat under this whole story since the firelight, how does a woman repay a man for her life, turned over in that snow cave into the far better one? What happens to 2 people? Each told their whole lives they were too much or too little, too silent or too grieved, to be simply and freely loved, when somebody who loved them both reaches up out of the grave to give them plain permission to stop keeping score. She answered it the only way that mattered, which was not with a speech. She folded her father's letter back along its soft, worn creases, and she did not keep it, though every grieving cell in her body wanted to. She reached across the dark, and she put it back into Thomas Wren's huge hands, and closed his fingers over it, back into the pocket against his heart, where it had lived for 15 years, because it was his, because it had always been his, because the old man had written it for the silent one, and Della would not take from him the one thing anyone had ever given him to keep. And then she took out the small thing she had carried up the mountain without ever quite admitting why. A worn little juniper whistle, dark as a chestnut, the twin of the one at his throat, the one he had carved for a small girl crossing a flooded creek 15 years before, and that she had kept in a drawer her whole life, without knowing she was keeping it for this. And she held it up in the matchlight where he could see it, and she put it to her own lips, and she blew it, one clear two-note call in the buried dark, the only words she had that were in his language, and the silent man's weathered face came apart at the sound of it, and he understood every single thing she meant. The thaw came hard in the days after they brought the survivors down, the way the high country spring always breaks at last, the lower trails running to mud and meltwater, the valley loud with the news of it, for the survey had come down off the mountain transformed, 8 living men and the dead surveyor's daughter telling and retelling in the saloon and the store and the street. The thing that had happened up at Wolf Ear, how the route had been forced through over the mute guide's written warning, how the slope had come down exactly as he said it would, how the man they had all called the savage had brought the mountain down on his own terms, and then dug 8 of them alive out of the snow with his bare hands. Cedar Gap, which had spent 30 years being certain about Thomas Wren, did not know where to put its face. And in the surveyor's office and the territorial telegraph, the dated written record in the field book, Wolf Ear will slide today, do not go up, in the silent man's own hand, witnessed now by 8 men who owed him their lives, began to do its quiet damning work, and the name of Augustus Pell began to be spoken in a new and dangerous way. The truth was out, and breathing, and climbing down the mountain toward the capital, and there was only one thing left that could stop it, and Augustus Pell, who had ridden down off that mountain frightened and ridden back up it cold, knew exactly what that one thing was. He came back up the thawing trail with 4 hired men, not survey men. These were hard cases brought up from the railhead camps with money and no questions, men with lever-action rifles across their saddlebows. And Pell rode in the middle of them in his fine fur coat, with the calm of a man who has done his arithmetic and does not intend to lose. His reasoning was simple and terrible. The witnesses were scattered down in the valley, too many to silence, but witnesses without the record were only frightened men telling a confused story, and frightened men can be doubted and bought and worn down by lawyers. The thing that would actually hang him was the field book, the cold-dated expert testimony that turned a tragic accident into his personal murder. And the field book was up the mountain at the Timberline cabin, with the mute man who could not testify with his mouth, and the woman who could. Augustus Pell rode up to destroy a book, and to bury, along with it, the only 2 people who could put it into a judge's hands. He did not come to bargain. He came, as a certain kind of frightened, powerful man always finally comes, to make the problem go under the ground where problems belong. They reached the high cabin at the treeline in the cold, clean blue light of a late mountain afternoon, the great heeled snowfields above blazing white in the sun, and the sky scrubbed a hard, cloudless blue. And that is the picture you must hold, because the reckoning of this story does not happen in shadow or in storm. It happens in broad, brilliant, high-country daylight, with the spring sun throwing itself back off the snow into every face. And it is not gloating, and it is not the end of the story. Pell sat his horse a little back from his line of guns, and he had one of the hired men call out that there was a legal matter regarding the survey records, that the occupants should come on out and bring all papers and books, and make this easy. Inside the cabin, Thomas Wren stood up slow from the bench by the cold hearth, and he looked once at Della, and once at the field book at his chest, his whole voice, and now apparently his death warrant. And he did the truest thing about him under all the silence. He moved to put himself between the danger and the person behind him. He took the book off over his head and pressed it into Della's hands and closed her fingers over it the way she had closed his over the letter, and wrote one last note on the cover and showed her, and it said, "Take the book south. I will hold them." And then the man who could not speak walked out the cabin door alone and unarmed into the brilliant snow to stand between 4 rifles and the woman with the record, exactly the way he had stood at the foot of the slope 9 days before, with his bare hands thrown out against a mountain. It went bad fast, the way these things always go bad, faster than thought. But Augustus Pell, for all his cold, careful arithmetic, had made the same mistake every loud man in this story had made from the very beginning. He had looked at the silence of Thomas Wren and read it as helplessness, and he had looked at Della Hartley and read her as a frightened girl with a book, and he was wrong about both of them, and the mountain was about to teach him the same lesson it had been teaching that valley for 30 years, which is that the quiet ones are the ones who have been paying attention. Because the mute guide had not walked out that door to surrender, and he had not walked out to die. He had walked out to do the one thing he knew how to do, better than any man alive, the thing 9 days of horror had proved past all argument. He had walked out to read the mountain. And Thomas Wren, standing in the bright snow with 4 rifles trained on his chest, lifted his eyes past the hired men, up the dazzling sunlit face of the slope above the cabin, the very slope, healed and reloaded with a winter's worth of snow and now baking under a hard spring sun. And he heard, under his boots and in his bones, and in the deep hollow drum of the warming pack, the thing he had spent his whole life listening for. The slope was ready, and the silent man, who could not shout a warning to save his life, put the little juniper whistle to his lips one last time and looked Augustus Pell dead in the eye and blew. He blew the slope down. He had stepped in the cold, unhurried calculation he had made the instant he came through the door onto the one narrow tongue of wind-scoured rock that the snow could not reach, the same kind of safe spine he had used at Wolfear. And he had put the 4 hired men and their horses and Augustus Pell exactly where the run-out would go. And then he triggered it with the one clear note his whole valley had spent 30 years calling savage, and the warming spring slope let go with the deep world-ending whoomp that 2 of those men had heard once before and would hear in their nightmares forever. The horses understood before the men did. They came apart and bolted an instant before the white wall hit, and the hired cases took one look at the mountain coming down on them and broke, flung themselves from their saddles and ran, and clawed for the edges of the runout, rifles forgotten, every thought of the book and the money blown out of their heads by the oldest terror there is. The slide missed the rock where Thomas Wren stood calm with the whistle at his lips. It didn't quite reach the cabin. It caught the lower open ground in a churning tail and knocked 2 of the running men down and buried them to the chest and left them harmlessly, suddenly done with the whole business of murdering anyone. and it took Augustus Pell's fine horse out from under him and dumped the speculator on his back at the margin of the runout, unhurt, bareheaded, his fur coat full of snow, staring up the mountain at the man he had called a dumb savage, who stood above him on the bare rock in the brilliant sun, untouched, having just, without a single word, defeated 4 armed men and a fortune with one note blown on a carved whistle. And then, this is the part that matters. This is the part the whole story was climbing toward. Della Hartley walked out of the cabin into the bright snow with the field book in one hand, and in the other, leveled and steady, her dead father's old long rifle, which Thomas Wren had taught her over those shut-in days at the Timberline to load and to hold, never once telling her why it might matter, perhaps never letting himself know. She did not point it at the buried, beaten men in the snow. She walked to where Augustus Pell lay floundering bareheaded at the edge of the runout, and she stood over him with the rifle and the book, the daughter of the man whose work he had tried to bury, and the keeper now of the record that would hang him, and the survivors of his greed already coming up the thawed trail behind her, drawn by the roar of the slide. And she said the only words spoken aloud in the whole of that reckoning, clear and flat and carrying across the bright snow to every man floundering in it. 8 men are alive who can name what you did. This book is dated in his hand, and the next slope you climb past him, Mr. Pell. You climb past me too. She lowered the rifle. She did not need it. Now get off this mountain while it's still letting you. He went. Of course he went. Men like Augustus Pell always go in the end, when the arithmetic finally turns. And it had turned on him completely, and in front of witnesses in the cold, bright air. He floundered up out of the snow and got one of the panicked horses by the trailing rein, and hauled himself onto it bareheaded and graceless, all the calm and all the contempt gone off his soft face at last, and the last that anyone on that mountain ever saw of the man who had called the truth a savage and tried to bury it under the snow was his snow-stuffed fur coat going down the muddy, thawing trail at a dead run, past the very survivors who had come up to see, with his fine hat lying behind him in the runout where it had fallen. The 2 buried hired men were dug out by the survey survivors who knew now exactly how it was done, who had been taught by the best, and sent down the mountain on foot. And they did not stop in Cedar Gap, and they were not seen in that country again. And Thomas Wren came down off the bare rock spine into the bright snow, and walked past the wreckage of the men who had come to kill him, and went to Della, and the 2 of them stood in the brilliant, ruined daylight with the field book between them, having said almost nothing, having needed to say almost nothing, which had been the language of the 2 of them from the firelight on. The end of it is quiet, the way the true ends of true things always are. The record did its work. A territorial man came up from the Capitol that spring with a clerk and a satchel, and the field book, 8 pages of dated, block-lettered, expert warning in the hand of the only man on the mountain who had read it right, witnessed now by every living survivor, became the spine of the whole reckoning. The forced route, the goading, the overruled warning, the 3 dead chainmen, the ride back up with hired guns to destroy the evidence. It all came out, piece by piece, into the daylight, and Augustus Pell did not go to a frontier grave, which would have been the clean, easy end of him. He went to the far worse thing for a man built like he was built, a courtroom, with his own purchases of the worthless wolf-ear land laid out on the table and read aloud into the record. The whole patient, murderous scheme traced line by line, while the territory sat and understood at last that 3 men had died, so 1 man could make the land he'd bought for nothing worth a fortune. His holdings were seized. His name became, from the capital to the coast, exactly the curse he had ridden up the mountain to prevent. And the railroad, when at last it came, crossed the divide by the low southern notch, the safe one, the one the mute guide had been quietly leading them toward from the first day. And they did not name it for him, because the men who name things in capitals never do. But every engineer who ever took a train safely over that pass was riding on the silence of a man the valley had called a savage. Thomas Wren stood up that spring in the eyes of the whole country that had written him off, as the one man who had read the mountain true when it counted and saved 8 lives with his hands, and his attention, and his lifelong unbroken quiet. The town that had called him the savage for 30 years did not all at once learn how to speak to him. Towns do not change that fast, and some of those men would go to their graves not quite able to meet his eye, ashamed in the particular way of people shown, in public, the exact shape of their own cruelty. But the word was finished. It died that spring in Cedar Gap and was not spoken again, and in its place came a thing the valley had never once given him, the plain hard respect of people who have finally, at terrible cost, learned to listen. The 7 men he had pulled alive out of Wolf Ear, and the 8th from the edge of the dark, came up the mountain that summer, 1 and 2 at a time, not to thank him in words, which none of them had, but to sit a while in his cabin door and look at the country with him in silence, which was the only language he had ever trusted, and which they had learned at last to speak. And Della Hartley did not go back down to the valley to live the safe, small life that everyone assumed a surveyor's daughter would go back to. On the first warm morning that the high meadow below the cabin showed its first green through the last rotten patches of snow, she stood at the edge of it in the spring sun with the field book in her hands, and she gave it back to him, properly this time, with the whole story finished and the danger gone and nothing owed by anyone to anyone. And as she put it into his huge weathered hands, she said the truest thing that anybody says in the whole of this story. "I came up this mountain thinking I owed you my life," she said, "and I spent the whole winter trying to find a way to pay it, and bracing for the day you'd name the price." She looked at the book and at the slope above them, healed and white and silent in the sun, and then at him. "There's no price. There never was. My father told you that 15 years ago, and you've been waiting all this time for me to climb up high enough to hear it. So I'm not staying because I owe you. I don't. You made sure I don't." Her cracked hands were perfectly steady. "I'm staying because up here with you is the first place in my whole life I've ever been heard without having to say a single word, and I am not going back down to be loud." He did not give a speech back to her. Men like Thomas Wren never do. The words were not in him and never had been, and the whole point of the 2 of them, from the very first night at the firelight, was that they never once needed to be. He looked at her a long moment in the brilliant spring light, the dead surveyor's daughter who had learned to read him the way her father had, the one person in 30 years who had climbed high enough and quiet enough to receive what the old man had told him to give away for free. And then he reached up and took the little juniper whistle off over his own head, the one he had carried at his throat his whole grieving, silent life, his avalanche signal, his one allowed sound, and he put the rawhide cord over Della's head instead, and settled the worn, dark whistle against her chest where the book had written, and he wrote one last thing in the field book, and turned it so the spring sun fell on it, and held it up between them where she could read it. And what it said was, "Now we both have a voice." And Della Hartley put her hand over the whistle at her chest and understood every single thing he meant, which was every single thing a wedding could have meant, and a great deal more besides. And it asked nothing of her and owned no part of her, and there was no preacher in it, and no ring and no need in the wide world of any of those things, Only two people who had each spent a lifetime being told that what was wrong with them was the very thing that made them unlovable, the silence or the grief, standing together in the bright spring morning above the country that had cast them both out, having finally, freely and without a single word, decided to stop. The high meadow greened up that summer richer and deeper than anyone in that country could remember. The way burned over and snowed under and grieved over ground always comes back hardest after the worst of the year has come, all the way down on it, and finally moved on. The railroad crossed the safe southern notch, and the trains ran, and nobody died. Old survey men who had laughed at a mute savage learned, the rest of their lives, to go quiet and watch a slope the way he had taught them to, without ever saying a word. And up at the Timberline, in the door of a cabin you could not have found in a year of looking, a huge silent man, and the woman who had learned to hear him sat through the long mountain evenings and watched the light come up gold on the granite, the way he had once promised a dying man it would, and on a rawhide cord at her chest a little juniper whistle, worn dark as a chestnut, caught that same gold light summer after summer and held it. The field book filled and was replaced, and filled again, a whole shelf of them in the end. 30 years of a man's quiet attention to a mountain, the longest and truest thing anyone in that country ever wrote. And the woman who had climbed up high enough to read it read every word. Because here is the thing the cold teaches you. If it does not kill you first, and you live through enough of it to learn, the mountain never once asked a man to be loud. It only ever asked him to listen, and the loudest, surest, most important people in the whole valley had simply never learned how, and it cost 3 of them their lives to find it out. So I will leave it with you the same way the mountain left it with her, up there in the snow and the bright spring after, when the quiet one plants himself in your path and points at the slope and will not go on when he has no words to give you, and every loud and certain and important man you know is already climbing. Do you trust the silence that has kept itself alive up here, alone, for 30 years? Or do you follow the confident voices that have never once been tested by the snow? Sit with that one a while tonight. The wind up here never stops asking it, and it does not ask you any question you can answer with a word.